Well, the room got awfully quiet for a minute there. I thought that's my cue to get up here and get things started. So we'll go ahead and kick things off for today's meeting. I want to start by welcoming everybody to the WIRE's fall meeting in Washington, D.C. We have a great venue here. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists, so I'm looking forward to a really interesting and informative program today. So before I get things kicked off to the actual substantive program, just one or two introductory items. Yesterday, WIRE's had its elections for officers and board members for 2026. So we'll be putting out an announcement as to the changes in the composition of the board and the new officers soon, so look forward to that. But as part of that process, we always have a situation where we have to have one board member cycle off to allow for a new board member to come on. And that was, of course, the situation for this year. So in conjunction with that, I wanted to take an opportunity to recognize Natasha Deshane, who's currently on the board, and National Grid for their longtime support for WIRE's and their participation at the leadership level at WIRE's. So as part of that, Natasha, if you could come up here. We have an award that I'd like to give you for your service on the board and your participation on behalf of National Grid with WIRE's. Appreciate your counsel and your leadership over the time you served on the board and the strong support of National Grid for WIRE's during that time period. So thank you very much. So with that, I guess we're going to go ahead and move on to the start of our program. And we're really delighted to have, as our keynote speaker today, Commissioner Lindsay See, who's going to come up and talk to us about, hopefully, some items around transmission, but other items that are of importance to her as her role on the commission. So, Commissioner See, if I could invite you to come up here, join me in the WIRE's living room area, and we'll have a nice chat. And at the end of our discussion, Commissioner has agreed to take questions from the audience. So don't leave me hanging, guys. When we get to that point, please think about some questions you would like to ask the Commissioner. This is a great opportunity to hear from her, so we need to take advantage of it. All right? So we'll go ahead and get started.
What's that?
Sure, go ahead. Wherever you want. So I'll just start off with a little bit of a general overview of Commissioner See, and then open it up for her to talk about some of the items that she would like to talk about, and also some of the questions that I have for her. So Commissioner See joined the Commission in June of 2024. Before that, she served as Solicitor General of West Virginia, where she managed appellate and other high-stakes litigation on behalf of the state of West Virginia. She's had a particular focus on energy and administrative law. She's argued at least twice before the U.S. Supreme Court. She's also appeared before the Supreme Court of Appeals for West Virginia. She was a legal practitioner here in D.C. Prior to that, so she's familiar with our town as well. And she had previously served as a law clerk to the Honorable Thomas Griffith on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. I had the pleasure at an earlier stage in my career of arguing many times before the Court of Appeals, so I know that's a tough circuit to appear before. She is a proud, I didn't know this was a phrase for somebody from Michigan, Michigander, right? Yeah. And now a mountaineer. Right. So with that, Commissioner, I thought I'd start by just asking if you could tell us a little bit about what your path was to getting on the commission, and what's your experience been like during this first year when you've been at FERC?
Definitely. Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here this morning. Really been looking forward to sharing this time with you. Thank you, Larry, for putting this together.
Sure.
I also have to say congratulations on the award for coming off of the board and for that service. When I saw the award, I said, that's one of the coolest awards I've ever seen. And then my second thought was, oh, wow, we must be in a room of energy nerds to think that that's the coolest award I've ever seen. But no, when I started my career, I did not think that I was going to be in the energy sector. I am a lawyer. I'm from Michigan originally. I grew up in the Metro Detroit area. And then after law school, I had the privilege of clerking for former Judge Griffith here in DC on the DC circuit. That was a wonderful experience to learn from him. And he gave me some advice that has really stuck with me, because what he would say is, you know, if we're lucky, lives and careers are long, and there's nothing wrong with a 5 or 10 year plan, but there's also a lot that can be gained from being open to the next right and meaningful opportunity when it comes time for a change in your career. And at the time, we sort of gave him a hard time. We said, that's easy to say when the next right change took you to the DC circuit. But I think that there is a lot of wisdom to that. You know, I think if we pooled everyone on their stories, I think a lot of people would have career directions that maybe took them in a way they didn't necessarily expect. But I'm a lawyer, I'm a litigator. I consider myself, you know, a nerdy litigator at heart. I had the great privilege of starting my career here in DC at a great law firm where I was focused on appellate and administrative matters, but not on energy at that point. I was really doing more telecom and securities and accounting work. And that really gave me the bug for these very technical areas of law and policy, but that have very large and real world consequences for real people. So I was really interested in that from early on. Had a great experience there, learned from a lot of incredible lawyers, and then I had the opportunity to do something totally different, to go to West Virginia. I'm not from there, as I mentioned. I grew up in Michigan. I didn't have any connections, but had the chance to move to Charleston, West Virginia about 8 years ago now to join the Attorney General's office, and I served as a Solicitor General for West Virginia for the better part of 7 years. And that role essentially means overseeing all of the appeals for the states. There was a wide variety. There was criminal work and consumer protection and tax work, but that's where I really started focusing more on energy and environmental law. A lot of the work that state AGs do can be driven by the Attorney General's policy priorities in the state's interest. And given West Virginia's particular role as an energy sector, we did a lot of work, especially on the federal space in the energy side. So I was able to bring kind of that more technical work more generally and really start focusing on the energy area. And had the privilege to work on a number of cases kind of across the space, in the state courts, and then in the U.S. Supreme Court as well. Had the honor to lead the state there. And one of those cases was a higher profile one, West Virginia versus EPA, that was really focusing on, states' interest and roles of agencies. And it's hard to say what particularly gets you, noticed or asked to be considered for a role, but I think that, probably opened up some doors. And I was really honored to be approached, to ask to consider serving on FERC. It's different from what I had done before. I don't litigate right now. And a number of people said it seems an odd fit if a lot of what I had done in West Virginia was challenging agency rules to then be working at a federal agency. But I found it a really natural transition to be able to take the experience I had on the state side and bring it to the federal level. And I think I'd say there's maybe 3 things that I have really taken from that experience that have informed the way that I'm approaching this role. One is, as I have said, I'm a litigator who knows how to challenge agency rules. So when we are issuing agency rules, I'm very mindful of that, of what would someone who had a job like me say in court to try to undermine what we just came out with. So legal durability and the strength of the orders we issue is something that's incredibly important to me. The second thing would be the state focus. When I was here in DC, I would say as a theoretical matter that I believed important work happened at the state and local level, but I found myself when I was getting ready to make that transition realizing that I'd kind of drunk the Kool-Aid of being here in DC, where you start to have the bias that the only important work actually happens on the federal level. And after 7 years in West Virginia, I am really happy to say that there is important work that happens here for sure, but really critical work is happening at the state side. And so I just was so honored and privileged to get to learn from the people in my state and representing our state and our agencies there. And so as I bring to this role, I think being on the state side, there are things where federal leadership and uniformity is incredibly important. And I'm really aware of the benefits that I think federal regulatory work can do, but also recognizing the importance of real regional differences and making sure we get those perspectives from the states as well. So that definitely informs the way that I do my work here. And then the last thing I would say is I had a lot of direct interaction with our industry in West Virginia and regionally and across the country when we were working with national coalitions. And one of the things that I kept hearing over and over is they would tell me, we care about what the rule is, don't get us wrong on that, but we need stability in what the rules are. We need to know what the rules of the road are, especially in the energy sector when we have hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of investment decisions and we have actions that are taking place on decades level, not just months or a couple of years. And so that idea of regulatory predictability and certainty, I saw how important that was when I was closer to working with our own state industry and regional industry, and that's something that's informed the work I've done here. And those things have definitely been really important in ways that I thought would be true, but even in ways I didn't necessarily think they would be true, because this space has changed so much in the past couple of years. We have a couple of new colleagues who were just confirmed, so excited to welcome them to the commission. And I was really struck when I was listening to their confirmation hearings, because the sort of questions they were getting were not the questions that me and my other colleagues were getting, not even 2 years ago. Our confirmation hearing was in March 2024. No one asked us about large load growth. No one asked us about data centers. And it is a little bit shocking to think about that now, because those are conversations that we have literally every day, and I know that's what everyone in this room is thinking about. So the pace of change and the opportunities in front of us are really incredible. And so I think those sort of perspectives that I bring from my background, I think become even more important as we are trying to move so quickly through this space and to meet new challenges of what does it look like to give the sort of predictability and certainty to make decisions in an uncertain and fast-changing time? What does it look like to give uniformity and rules of the road without losing the need for individual and regional and state and industry differences? Those are the sort of things, again, that I said I thought were going to be important coming into this role and became even more important than I thought they would. So this is an exciting time for all of us. We've got so many opportunities and challenges ahead of us, and I feel really honored and really privileged to be able to be in this role for this particular moment.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a really good overview of a perspective of a lot of things. I think it's really interesting to hear you're focusing on the change and the pace of change that we're seeing now. I know when I first started in this industry back shortly after the invention of the light bulb, it seemed like things were changing, but at a pace where it's a little bit easier to absorb it. But you can certainly see an acceleration like we haven't seen before.
Absolutely.
I think, certainly in the last decade, but even less than that. And you've got an industry that is, I think, working hard to keep up with that, but the constructs may not necessarily be accommodating of that. So anyway, enough of more about you than me. Let me switch over. You mentioned a little bit about some new colleagues coming on to the commission. We're at the process now of onboarding 2 new commissioners. I'm curious as to what you think, as to how you see the new additions to the commission, the changes of the commission affecting both the operations and the policy-making process at FERC.
I think coming into FERC, I have just really come to appreciate so much the value of having different voices and perspectives when it comes to the decisions that are in front of us. I've really valued my colleagues over the past year and just the different backgrounds and experiences that we bring. I hope that my colleagues can learn from the particular experience I bring, but I know for certain that I have learned from them. Like so many areas where, I didn't have particular expertise before, and being able to understand their perspective. I think that and I know that has made our decisions stronger and better, having those different voices. So I've really appreciated the colleagues that I have worked with over the past year, and have great respect for the 2 colleagues who have left since the time that I have been there. Have great relationships with my current commissioners right now, and I'm really excited to see that continue with our new colleagues who are joining us. I've had a number of conversations with them already. I'm eager to get to know them more, but I can already see the sort of urgency and excitement that they're also bringing to this role, that they have a real sense of understanding of the importance of this moment and in their role in it. So I think that when we are at full strength at 5, I think we do our best work. We can do our best work, and being able to build those relationships and make sure that we are learning from each other and strengthening the work together. I think that is critical for us as an agency, and I'm really optimistic to see that continue with our new colleagues coming in.
So FERC itself is dealing with some challenges right now. There's currently a hiring freeze in place. We've seen a fair amount of attrition at the staff level. I mean, FERC has, I think, better than some other agencies, weathered some of the changes over the last several months. But nonetheless, I think Chairman Rosner mentioned that there's been at least a 10% attrition over the most recent period of time. I'm curious, how do you see those changes, those challenges affecting how the Commission operates, and are you concerned about the Commission's ability to get the job done with some of those changes?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is we cannot do our work without our staff, and our staff is incredible. I know we have so many former FERCers here, and so I'm preaching to the choir in that sense. It was funny when I joined, because I hadn't been at FERC in particular. One of the things that you get to do is you get kind of a book of resumes of people in the agency who are interested in working in a commissioner's office, and so you go through a lot of interviews. I have a couple members of my team right here, Scotia and Danielle, who have been a long time FERC staffers, and really fortunate to have them with me. But during that process, you get to know about the agency and you talk to a lot of people, and I kept hearing how much people were committed to and loved the work they did in the community at FERC. I remember talking to my partner afterwards and saying, it is possible I joined a cult. People love FERC in a way that I had not seen in other places before. And so I kept kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop for a while, but it hasn't, because it really is a special place with people who are very expert in what they do, really driven and committed. And we have such a huge volume of work that we do. We put out thousands of orders across the agency every year. We literally cannot do that work without that staff. So that's where I start from, is we need them. And attrition is normal to some extent, right? Partly, that happens everywhere, and we have people who are really highly in demand, but there are some challenges, especially when it comes to the hiring freeze and not being able to fill those spots. We have a workload that is going up, given the pace of change that we've been talking about and other needs, and if we're not able to fill those spots, at some point, that's a math equation that could give us some concern. Right now, I'm really proud of the hard work that our staff is doing, being able to work at a faster and really thoughtful and, legally durable pace. We've got incredible people who are leaning in. So the agency is in a good place. We are strong. We're doing the work that we need to. We're obviously looking very carefully at what happens in the months ahead, but our staff has always been incredible, and they still remain that way today.
Well, congratulations. You have joined a pretty cool club, I have to tell you. And it's great to get to get events like this and, reconnect with people that you worked for. I've been gone for about 10 years, and I still slip into using the word "we" when I refer to FERC at times, even to this day. So welcome to the club.
All right, thank you.
I want to move on to a couple of more substantive areas, though, that I know of real interest to me and to other people in the room. One of the topics that we focused on a lot, I know you know this because I've been talking to you about it, is incentives. Particularly incentives related to transmission. One of the major items that's been under consideration for a long time now is the RTO adder, and I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that, the role of that adder in supporting the FERC's regulatory goals.
Definitely. Before I answer that, and I promise I will, one comment you made reminded me, I meant to say at the outset that coming in and meeting with me and my staff, I have found that incredibly valuable over the time that I've been at the Commission. Whenever I say that, there's a part of me that says, be careful what you wish for, and open up that door. But I know many of you are already taking advantage of that, and I just want to encourage you to and let you know that from my perspective, I find those meetings very helpful to understand what matters to you, what matters to your members, to your clients, how the sort of policies we're considering are affecting real decisions and affecting people on the ground. So please do. I have an open door policy and want to talk with you. I've also really enjoyed over the past year starting to kind of get out in the real world more and see a lot of the incredible projects and infrastructure we have. So that's another invitation that I will open up. There is no substitute for seeing on the ground what our infrastructure looks like in this country to understand a lot of the opportunities and challenges we have. So if there's something you think would be helpful for us to see, obviously there's only so many places we can go in a year. So again, careful what you wish for opening that invitation, but I found a lot of value in that. But now I'll get to the RTO adder. So my view on incentives are, I think that they are an incredible tool that can help us fulfill our core mission at the Commission when it comes to reliable and affordable power delivery. And and I think we need to look at kind of where we are in this moment. We're at a time where we need electrons to be able to get where they need to in an efficient and a cost-effective manner, and that's going to require new investments and new development, and we need that quickly. So I think that incentives can play a really powerful role in moving that forward. I'm also really mindful of a lot of the concerns that come from the rising cost in transmission and how that affects ratepayers. So I think as a Commission, we have to look at both of those. When it comes to the RTO adder, I think that there can be a lot of value that comes from encouraging voluntary membership in the organized markets. We've seen over their history huge benefits to consumers in terms of efficiency and reliability and economic benefits. So I think that there is a lot of benefit that can come from this adder. I will also say, and maybe I should have started here, to some extent I view it doesn't really matter what I think, because Congress told us that this is an incentive that matters, and I take that really seriously as a rule of law person. We have a statute that tells us we shall give an incentive to entities that join the RTO, so I take that seriously too. Congress didn't tell us specifically what that needs to look like, but that is a policy judgment that Congress has made, and there's a lot of wisdom behind it. So I see a lot of value there when it comes to advancing our core mission, but also understanding that we have to be accountable to and understand the cost consequences on all sides of the equation.
Well, great. From your lips to God's ears, as far as I'm concerned on that. But I also want to tie just...
I don't know who the God of incentives would be, but...
But I want to tie this discussion around incentives back to something you talked about earlier, which is the importance of regulatory certainty and the ability of industry to be able to, have a sense of being able to rely on the Commission's determinations as it makes decisions about long-term investment going forward. The RTO adder is certainly one of them. There are other tools in the regulatory toolbox, though, that have been helpful in the incentives arena, things like QIP, the abandoned plant incentive. Do you have any different thoughts with respect to those? How do you see those fitting into the broader incentives picture?
I think, again, maybe I'll start this one where I ended the last one. Again, Congress has made a judgment that incentives are valuable and important, and that is something, there's a lot of wisdom to that. When it comes to QIP and abandoned plant, there's a lot of value that can come from reducing the cost of financing or making sure that we can move forward, needed investments in projects, especially when there are long construction and permitting timelines. So I think that there's a really valuable role to play there at a time when we need to be encouraging smart and responsible transmission decisions. But like I mentioned, we also have to make sure that when we are looking at our incentives policy, that it is being responsible to the costs of those investments that are being made. So kind of the way that I look at this is I take seriously our existing policy in terms of the presumptions that are in place when there's a project that has already received a state CPCN or has gone through a regional planning process and has been selected there. I think a lot of the value there is we see kind of outside third parties who have signed off on the economic benefits, the needed benefits of these projects. And so I think there's a lot of value in those presumptions because it gives that extra accountability. And then when it comes to, of course, it's not the only way to receive an incentive. There can be a project that goes through our independent showing prong. I am pretty careful when I look at those because, of course, it doesn't have that outside, kind of, I guess, extra layer of accountability there. So I do, and I have, voted on orders, or we have granted incentives under that independent showing. But I think it's appropriate for us when we're balancing these needs of encouraging important investment, but making sure that they're the sort of things where it is in fact responsible to transfer the risk that the project won't go forward to the ratepayer. I think that evidence needs to be appropriately strong. And then I think the last thing I'd say, and this does go back to the way that I view regulatory certainty, is our incentives policy isn't perfect. It's never going to be that way. But I think it's really important that if the Commission is going to consider changes, we do that in a transparent and predictable way. So I think it's important that this is the policy that we have, and unless and until either we have projects that get outside of the just and reasonable realm, and we haven't seen that yet, in my view. But short of that, I think if there's going to be changes the commission makes, it's really important to make sure that we are doing it in an appropriate and transparent manner. So that is my focus. If we have a policy that I think makes sense, and that's how I look at the presumptions and the independent showing, but if it comes to changes there, I think that's not something that we should be doing on an ad hoc basis, but be something the commission should be considering through an appropriate rulemaking or other generic action, so that there is that kind of transparency and predictability when it comes to the industry and how the commission is looking at these important issues.
So just to continue a little bit more on the incentives theme, we've got different types of transmission. We have interregional, regional, and local transmission. Do you think that there are certain types of transmission that might be worth having more incentives on to try to encourage or not? And between those three areas, interregional, regional, and local, where do you see the greatest need for more investment and development?
I mean, this may feel like the glib answer, but I think we just need common sense, practical solutions. And I think we're at a time where we need an all-of-the-above approach here. I think that there are smart investments in all of these areas. I do think that we are in a time where we are seeing build-out, and we need to see that in order to meet the growing energy demands we have in the country. So I'm supportive of smart investments in all of those areas. But I think when we say kind of all of the options on the table, I think this is an opportunity, I'd say, that I'm also a big believer in making sure we're doing the most with what we already have as well. And I think that goes to, our responsibility to make sure that we are building out the grid that we need to be available for us now to meet our needs and to be, available for the future. But how do we make sure that we're being responsible to the people who are ultimately footing those bills? So I think, again, when it comes to grid enhancing technologies and encouraging, making sure that we are taking advantage of all of the tools on the table, I think that's critical, because this is a both and situation. We need new builds, we need upgrades to existing infrastructure, and we need to make sure that when we are saying, yes, it is responsible, to transfer some of the risk to ratepayers for new builds, that those are things that are actually necessary, and we've taken advantage of all of the other enhancing technologies on the table. I think that's another area where in Section 219, our statute that talks about incentives, we have specific authority to be, looking more proactively at grid enhancing technologies, and I think that's an area where the commission can be doing more. So this is a both and, right? Especially in a time when I think we need to do a lot of new and costly investments, and given how important that is, I think it's even more important to make sure that we're not forgetting the other side of how can we take advantage of cost-effective options on the shorter term to get the most out of the infrastructure we already have.
So you can't go to any energy conference these days without the topic of AI and data centers coming up. You
Absolutely.
already mentioned it a little bit, and I want to touch a little bit on that as it relates to transmission. One of the areas of focus is just the timeline and the speed with which we need to try to integrate those resources into the grid. How do you think transmission owners and developers can try to move quickly to accommodate the growing needs and demands associated with AI and data centers?
I think this is another area where this is a tension for all of us and a both and, right? Because that speed does matter. Growth at the AI scale can't scale without a grid that's able to support it. That is absolutely true, and we need to make sure that we are moving quickly in that direction, and we need to make sure that we are building out the grid in a smart way, in an efficient way, but it's also true to some extent that growth needs to happen yesterday, right? So I understand that urgency. I know you all appreciate that urgency. How do we do that in a way that is also smart planning and predictable planning? I know those of us at the Commission are thinking a lot about that. It comes back to what can we do to help give clarity to the rules of the road here when it comes to that sort of regulatory predictability that you all need. I also think we are seeing a lot of novel and creative proposals in terms of how to move faster and to connect resources to the grid. That's something when I look at it, certainly we have a role to play in terms of calling balls and strikes here, making sure that everything stays within a just and reasonable realm and is not unduly discriminatory. Those matter. I take those seriously. That's my role in the system. But I also never want want to be the person who is saying no to something just because we haven't done it before. I think there's an onus on all of us in this sector to make sure that we are being nimble and are open to new solutions. And so I hope as you all are thinking about that as well, I hope it's encouraging to know that when we are looking at those proposals, speaking for myself, but also the conversations I've had with my colleagues, we are really looking for ways that we can apply those predictable standards in our statutes, but that allow this kind of nimbleness and creativity moving forward, because I think it is going to require not being static in terms of the approaches that we've used before in order to meet the urgency of this moment.
And one of the other challenges we're seeing with respect to AI and data center growth is accommodating that on the one hand, while on the other hand try to balance it with meeting the traditional mission for companies of trying to serve their existing ratepayers. How do you think transmission owners can try to achieve that balance in a way that works?
Yeah. I think it's easy to think about what we have in front of us as challenges, and they are, right? But they're also opportunities. When I look at a lot of the growth in front of us as a nation, I think that's a good problem for us to have when it comes to economic development, when it comes to our position from a national security standpoint. So these are real challenges, but real opportunities too. And I think that I hope that we can think about this as not just figuring out how to do something totally new, faster, but how do we do the things we've been doing smarter? What does it look like to be really focused on the sort of upgrades to aging infrastructure that are going to get us a lot of bang for our buck, right? How do we think through mid-range and long-range transmission planning in a way that is smart, but when we can't use the past necessarily as a guide for what's coming? So how do we take some of the lessons we've had, but again, give that nimbleness to the type of planning there? And then how do we look at kind of short term as well? And again, I think that gets to what are some of the tools we have here, whether it's GETS or otherwise, that can let us, get some benefit, now in a shorter time frame where construction is. So I think this really is an opportunity for us to kind of think through what are the tools that we have that are working, and how do we just not totally reinvent the wheel, but be able to use them smarter as we're moving forward in this direction. There are a lot of challenges. We don't have all the solutions. I know you don't all have them, although you've got some great ones that I've been really encouraged to hear. But I think that's really a task for all of us, is how do we figure out how to make the tools we already have work well in a time that is changing so quickly.
So I'm going to give everybody a heads up. I have one more question, and then I'd like to turn it over to the audience, so get ready. This is your opportunity. But before I do that, I wanted to hit on one more topic that we're seeing increasingly now, which is the aging of our transmission system. A lot of our infrastructure on transmission was built in the 50s and 60s. If it was a person, it would be eligible for Medicare at this point, right? Or Social Security pretty soon. Some of it even goes as high as 100 to 120 years, which is amazing to me to think about. How do we go about trying to update all of this aging infrastructure along with all the other needs we've already talked about, while still trying to be cognizant of the issue affordability, which you hear talked about increasingly these days, and reliability as well. How do we try to deal with all of that when there's some tension there, actually?
Absolutely. I think when it comes to aging infrastructure, those are not the sexiest projects, right? Everyone wants to go out and say, here is a new, line that we are building, and this is, the new benefits that we're going to be adding. But those sort of infrastructure upgrades, I don't need to tell everybody in this room how critical they are, and they are critical when it comes to reliability and literally keeping the lights on for folks. So I think it is important for us not to lose sight of that. But the way I like to think about it is, I don't think that we should be focused, and I don't think folks are in the industry, on just rebuilding the grid of the past, but how do we make sure when we are making those upgrades that we are building for the grid of the future? And I think that matters so much when we're thinking about how to make sure we're not dropping the ball in this area, but still using those changes to be moving forward to where we need to go. I think there's a lot to be said for right sizing of these sort of projects, and I've got to be careful because when it comes especially to local projects here, we have open matters, so there's only so much I can talk about there. But I do think think that this, is kind of the overall way that, I look at these, and I know many of you are as well, is how do we make sure that we're not just trying to keep pace with what we've had before, but use those upgrades as an opportunity to build where we need to go and for the grid that we know that we are needing in the future.
Well, that was a great foreshadowing of our second panel we have later today.
Yes, and I'm disappointed I can't be here for that. It sounds like it's fantastic. We've got a member of my team who is going to be reporting back for sure.
Good. So let me...
Not to put you on the spot, Scotia.
So let me turn to the audience now and see if they have any questions that they would like to ask of the commissioner. So,
got a few? Okay, Craig, over here.
I'm coming, Craig. I'm coming.
Instead of hiding from Larry here.
Yeah, I can't see you, Greg.
Hi.
Very sneaky.
Thank you for doing this. Craig Glazer from PJM.
Yeah.
And just looking for actually some insight and advice for the panel, for the entire audience, with regard to the siting process. So something that's not directly in front of you, but as I think you may know, I have a second residence in West Virginia, your home state,
yes.
which I love dearly. And there's a very nasty fight going on right now over a transmission line, which we authorize at PJM. And the argument is that the line is needed to serve data centers in Northern Virginia. And people are arguing in West Virginia, there's no benefit to West Virginia specifically for this line. And it is true that we wouldn't build it but for the data center load in Virginia. There's not a particular need in West Virginia other than people obviously use the internet. So on one hand, you've got this huge local opposition. On the other hand, there was a recent Third Circuit case, very interesting case, where the court just said that a state cannot override regional determination of need. I don't know if you're aware of this case,
Yes.
but it turned on interstate commerce issues. So that says regional need trumps the local showing, and state, you're just going to have to live with it. So given that conundrum and the level of opposition we're seeing, what's your advice to all of us here in terms of how to approach the states, how to approach the siting process when, like a state like West Virginia, I can't say the line is particularly needed specifically for that state. If that's the test, I can't meet that test, but I can meet a test of a larger need. So welcome your thoughts and advice on that.
Yeah, I don't know, Craig, that I can solve this one for you. It turns out my people in West Virginia are really independent and have their own views on things. But I think this gets at the idea of how do we help shape and inform the public conversation when it comes to sort of infrastructure development that we need that does benefit all of us with the way that our economy is changing. And of course it's data centers and it's AI driven, which is something that affects people on a day-to-day level, but it's not just that. And I think sometimes those are the conversations that can take all the oxygen in the room. But what are other drives of increasing demand, and how do we help make sure that the conversation is as full as it needs to? I also think that we've got an opportunity, and I think PJM's a great example because I think about, my time in West Virginia, PJM state, and the first several years I spent in the AG's office when we were focused on energy issues, no one ever talked about PJM in the AG's office. Certainly our, PSC is. But I think that is incredible looking back at that now because the conversation has shifted so rapidly, right? We see the states and we see, others who are talking about affordability and other issues like that. And it's becoming front page news, in a way that the work we usually do is only in the trade press usually, right? And so I think that there is a real need for those of us in this space to, be part of that conversation and to make sure that, top line, ideas of prices are going up. That is true, right? But there's a lot of reasons for that, as we all know. And how do we help fill in the details about the reasons for that and, where economic growth is coming from? It doesn't solve all the problems, right? But I do think that being out in the communities and helping to shape those conversations, especially when we see that they are being had in other sectors in ways they haven't been, I think that's becoming increasingly important for us.
Well, you two did a great job now in the lead into our first panel, which is going to focus on that type of a topic as well. So thank you very much. That was fantastic.
That was not intentional, so maybe it was on Craig's part. Ben?
I'm going to stay on this side of the
Ben Glenn Lands, representing APC Media. Question about one of the last questions that Larry asked. So I'm not new to the industry from asset management and really the utility space, but policy is something I've only been involved in the last couple years and learning about. So when we talk about incentivizing utilities to make these long bets on this societal product, so to speak, the societal benefit that we're building here, how does FERC encourage utilities to take that long-term view instead of that short-term view? Because when we think about affordability, we think about a lot of times it's easy to justify low upfront costs, but really these are assets that Larry was saying can last over 100 years. So how do we, from a policy standpoint, encourage? Are there some things that exist now, or are there some things that you're thinking about in the future that could give utilities the incentive to think long-term?
Yeah, no, I think that's such an important question. And when I think about kind of federal policy, I think it's also important to remember that FERC is only one of the players there, right? And not just federal, but state as well. So I think more broadly, I think it's important if the rules of the road and the rules of decision and the timing is as clear as possible, I think that can provide a lot of value. So, we don't do, direct permitting of a lot of the transmission that we're talking about here, but we work a lot with our state partners who do to figure out how can we streamline and be more transparent and give that kind of certainty is elusive, right? But how can we give some sort of confidence in, what the rules of decision are going to be and what that timing is going to look like? We've talked a lot, earlier in the session about transmission incentives, and for good reason, because that is where FERC has, direct responsibility and a duty that Congress has given us to make sure that we are giving financial incentives for that long-term range. And I think part of it is if we're looking at incentives that really are looking at the whole life of the project, and how do we make sure that we're doing that in a smart way? So when I think about, transmission incentives in particular, I want to make sure that they're the sort of things that are encouraging those kind of smart investments that are taking the long range view, but also while not forgetting that short range view too. So that's where the idea of, I think if we're going to be giving incentives for needed but very expensive long-term projects, I think one of the ways we can do, and this feeds into the last question too about helping to inform the broader conversation, is if we can also be giving some assurance that we're not leaving anything on the table in terms of making the most with what we already have. Hopefully that can give a little bit of confidence on the front end too. But that's how I think through those pieces. Yeah.
Stu?
Sorry.
Good morning, Commissioner See. Thanks so much for being here this morning. You were part of the Resource Adequacy Tech Conference at FERC at the beginning of the summer.
Yes.
And NERC just issued their Resource Adequacy Report. And some of the recommendations related to the need for interregional transmission and broader planning for transmission.
Yeah.
How do you think about resource adequacy and the role of transmission, and what are some of the next steps for the Commission?
Absolutely. So I think resource adequacy, usually we start with the resources themselves, right? Generators, and I think that's important. And in that conference, I think we heard a lot about potential solutions in order to speed up builds. We don't do that directly. I can't directly permit a generator, but I think a lot about what we can do to help speed up the interconnection side of things. And I think that is something that we really took away from that conference as well. Is you can build as much as you can, but if there's an electron and it can't get where it needs to be, it can't get connected to the grid, it's not doing good there. So I know that's something that we're looking at closely as we had our Order 2023 that has really, hopefully, we'll see a lot of benefits in terms of clearing out queues and moving forward. But we're keeping a real close eye on what more can we be doing to help in that area and being open to more proposals on that side. I think we also saw just so many benefits in recent years with extreme weather events about neighbors being able to help neighbors and how critical that is. When I am looking at transmission policy, data-driven solutions is what matters to me, seeing demonstrated value in terms of reliability and in terms of economic benefits. And I think being able to see how that sort of infrastructure can literally save lives is compelling. So I think that that's an important piece we need to be looking at as we're looking at transmission policy as well. Yeah.
Good morning. Thanks, Commissioner See. Stuart Nackmius from Con Edison Transmission. Really appreciate your comments. As I'm listening to what everyone is saying here, I'm thinking about Order 1920 and compliance filings that are coming. And what was the least controversial part of that was of transmission planning and extending the horizon to 20 years. But when 1920 came out, right, we weren't yet talking about large loads and increase in supply. And there's a provision for scenarios, right? And those scenarios are going to become increasingly challenging, right? What are the supplies that are going to be here over 20 years? What is the load, right? And is it 20%, 30% of what the load is saying, right? Or so is FERC thinking at all, as these compliance filings are going to come in, looking for something on scenario planning? Like how, my question is, how are you thinking about that scenario planning, and how is that going to help, or is it going to just cause more concern over what is the right scenario?
No, I mean, I think you raised one of the critical and difficult questions for us, right, is how do we do smart planning when we don't necessarily know what's coming? You know, one of the things that I know we've been thinking a lot about is how are we all across the country thinking about load forecasting to try to help with a little bit more of that certainty, and those are tricky issues, right? I know Chair Rosner sent out a letter, recently to, our organized markets partners kind of think through how we are doing that kind of forecasting. I think that there's a lot of work that we can do there to help, give some more information. But, in terms of how we're looking at that sort of planning going forward, in one way, this is not a terribly helpful answer because I've got a couple new colleagues coming in. So, we're going to be having those conversations in real time. But I think being nimble in how we are thinking through planning and using new measures that do take account of different scenarios and different options going forward, I think that's going to be really key for us as we are trying to be as responsible as we can. But we're at a place where we just haven't been before, right? It's one thing to plan when you've had relatively flat growth, but when we have growth that is going up, and we know it's going up, but it's difficult to see exactly where and when, I understand those challenges there, and we want to work well with you all in real time to figure out the best ways that we can be moving forward with this kind of planning in a new environment. Yeah.
I think I saw one or two hands. Amanda?
Good morning, Commissioner. Amanda Rumsey with PPL. Going off of Christina's question that she asked and working with the states to really get more resources online, is there a role for FERC that you see in how to encourage that? And are there any ideas that might come to kind of address projects that get out of the interconnection queue but still are having trouble reaching construction?
Yeah. There's obviously so many factors that go into that, right? I wish I could fix supply chain issues, and I know all of us wish we could do that. There's a lot of concerns there. And so I think, a lot of us, as we've been trying to keep just a real open dialogue with the states and other partners to figure out, are there things that we can be doing to help? Some of it has been, can we be a forum to help the states share best practices, what's working, what's not? I think that's an area where FERC can play an important role. And we are also really focused on what can we do to help with the interconnection side of things. There's been a number of proposals that have come to us over the past year, all public, and we've acted on some of them, and we still have more coming forward. And, I view our role, as I said, is we have statutes that matter in terms of making sure that we have fair and predictable rules of the road, but there's a pretty broad range, in my view, of what just and reasonable can be, especially when we have new situations and urgencies. So I do think that being able to talk with the states and talk to the RTOs and ISOs and industry in terms of where's flexibility that's going to give us real, practical, real-world change at the pace we need. I am really open to those conversations because again, I can only speak for myself. I guess I forgot to give the standard disclaimer, not speaking for the commission. Hopefully that goes without saying. But speaking for myself, and I can say from conversations, I know this is something that matters to my colleagues, is we can't be in the position of only saying yes to things that we have done before, and we have to figure out how do our statutes apply to the time when we need to be moving in different and faster ways. So this is obviously an issue that we are all working through in real time, and we take that urgency seriously too.
Jamie?
Yeah, Jamie Similar.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
She's got the microphone.
Oh, thank you. So this may be kind of continuing with this conversation. You started at the in your opening talking about uniformity and yet predictability, and picking up on Amanda's question about the interconnection queue and your comments about flexibility. Can you talk a little bit about how you see flexibility working with uniformity? The Commission's put out a bunch of rules. Do mention 1920. We've got 2023, all of which are pretty prescriptive, and oftentimes I think we don't really know how those rules are going to play out until we see them in practice. And then oftentimes you're up against well, we just did this rulemaking and here are the rules, and we don't want to deviate from that. So if you could talk a little bit about flexibility, novel application against that backdrop of just having done rules. Thank you.
Right. Absolutely. I think my general approach when it comes to prescriptive rules, first of all, that's not most of what the Commission does. Most of what we do is reactive. We're responding to 205 filings that are coming in, good improvements that we're seeing across the industry, and we're basically calling balls and strikes and whether they're appropriate. So it is a small percentage of what we do, but it's an important percentage, and it obviously has a very, there's a lot of costs in terms of time and compliance for those rules. So when I think of rulemaking, I am really mindful of those compliance costs and want to make sure that in order to get the time to make all of those changes, that is really going to give demonstrated value that's worthwhile. And I think, part of it is as we're looking at, thinking about potential rulemakings going forward, I think especially because we're in a time where things are changing so quickly, I am really mindful of that concern that you just raised, that if we are too prescriptive, I don't want to be the one who is stifling innovation and new changes that we're seeing happen. So I really approach that as trying to be in listening mode a lot to figure out where would guidance and uniformity be helpful for the industry and the sector as we're moving forward, and where is it potentially a hindrance. And I know that's not, it doesn't give a lot of clear answer, but in terms of the way that I think through that, I think you're right. There can be benefit to say, okay, we need some clarity, right, on where the rules are here. But how narrow do those rules need to be? I think that there's a lot of room for, okay, we want things to be able to move forward well and not stifle that sort of flexibility. So it is a both and there's never going to be a one size fits all, but I think that's important as we're thinking through this. I don't want FERC to be in the business of saying we issued a rule just so we could say that we did something and solved this problem, right? That's not going to happen practically. But I also think that sometimes not acting can be the more prudent decision, especially as we're trying to figure out what is actually going to give helpful guidance moving forward. And there may be times when not being prescriptive is the best thing that we can do. So those are concerns that I do take really seriously when we think through the portion of our docket that is focused on more prescriptive and affirmative rulemaking.
So we're kind of coming to the point where we're going to need to bring it to a close. I would like to wrap up with one more question that occurred to me as we was listening to all of the discussion here, which is, we all know that policy-making, rulemaking process is never perfect. There are goals that are set, and hopefully the rulemakings move forward or achieve those goals. I guess I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on what the responsibility is of the agency after rulemakings are put into place to look back and see, is this actually doing what we thought it was doing? There's frequently a lot of unintended consequences associated with it. I know, at least from my time at FERC, that's actually not something FERC did at all, I don't think, or very little. And it's kind of left up to the regulated community to come back and say, hey, this is not working right. Well, what do you think in terms of FERC's responsibility, knowing that there's limited resources, but to kind of look back on, is this actually doing what we thought it was going to do, or should we make adjustments? I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
I think it's a really good question, and I think one of the bugs and features, depending on the topic of having multiple people on the commission cycling in and out, is that it's usually true that the commissioners who voted for a particular rule are not the ones who see it through all the way to compliance. And when I look at that, I think that we do have a responsibility to make sure that the rules that we issue are actually holding up their weight in terms of demonstrated value. But there's also a lot to be said for making sure that we give things time to work their way out, because you can't always see what the consequences are immediately. And there's just a cost from regulatory whiplash, right, of going from one direction to the other. And so I think that goes to, where I started is, I really took to heart a lot of those conversations I had with industry in my previous role about we just need some predictability, right? And predictability is not, excuse to say we're going to let something, stand for years on end that is obviously not serving its purposes. But I think it is prudent after there is a, big decision or big rule there, to give it some time to work out and see what those consequences really are, and to make sure that we are not acting rashly just to switch from one position to another. There are, of course, times when I think, we may see that the real world consequences are not what the Commission hoped that they would be. And I think to get to the other part of your question, I do think that we have a duty to revisit those rules, especially when we're seeing that those consequences are detrimental, or maybe they're getting some good, but overall it's not worth the cost. And I would say that that's something that there is so much going on right now in the industry and so much at the Commission that trying to assess priorities can be really challenging for all of us. And I would say that that's an area where a lot of times I hope that we can continue to stay really responsive to you and others who are actually living out the consequences of these rules and policy decisions on the ground. So please keep telling us what you're seeing, because I think that's really helpful. There can be a rule that we're like, I don't know, maybe not the best idea, but also is it really top of priority, to take the resources to revisit it now? You give us really critical information in terms of helping us prioritize where we can get the best value from the actions that we take. So I hope that's helpful in terms of how I think about that ongoing responsibility and how it fits into giving a predictable kind of rules of the road situation, but also not being blind to the consequences that we see over time.
Well, Commissioner, you've been really generous with your time. I would ask everybody to join me in thanking you and your staff for being here with us.
It's great to be with you all this morning. Really appreciated it.
So there's just going to be a brief transition.